Hi, I'm Chris Gates, and in this episode of Midlife Murmurings, I'm joined by Jonathan Salisbury, founder of Thinkfully. Jonathan's work is all about helping us not just what to think, but how to think, using 4 powerful strategies that unlock creativity, problem solving, and resilience. In our conversation, Jonathan shows how Thinkfully can be applied in everyday life and in the workplace, whether you're leading a team, shaping strategy, or simply navigating midlife decisions. If you're ready to sharpen your thinking and bring new energy into work, this episode is for you. Join us as we explore how to live and lead more thinkfully. Well, today's guest is my dear friend, Jonathan Salisbury. Jonathan's been devoting himself to helping people think better, which we're going to hear about how it can help us think better in midlife. But first of all, Jonathan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello. Thanks, Chris. I was thinking about how long we have known each other and think it's about 30 years. I'm Jonathan. I'm married to Lisa. We've got 4 children. 2 are kind of post-uni and one's about to start uni and the other one's taking his GCSEs this year. Career-wise, I've had a mix of corporate life and entrepreneurial life. I'm a Christian, and working that faith out in practice is an ongoing thing for me, and being part of a church family is important for that as well. And I help coach rugby with an under-16s team, which one of my boys is in. So that keeps me on my toes as well.
Fantastic. So first up, Jonathan, what does midlife mean to you?
So I think it's a point to pause, perch a bit, to kind of weave together the different threads that have made up life to now. Understanding myself and those around me better, looking forward, choosing where to focus, where to contribute for this next phase of life. So it's a kind of hinge point. Sense making is very much at the heart of it. We've developed some of the tools that we need to do that sense making in terms of developing listening skills and the ability to see connections and create patterns and recognize patterns. But also we've got the kind of wealth of experience of learning from all sorts of different people around us. It's definitely a vantage point to look around. Quite a lot of life can be quite a kind of linear progression. You're sort of driven by events, and then there is this point where maybe you're forced to stop and make sense of things. Or maybe just this sort of a bit of space opens up to do that.
I love the phrase that you used in there, to perch on that rock and to look at where we've come from and look at what's ahead and just take a temporary pause just to recalibrate and go, where are we now and how do we make sense of what's happened and who we are now and what the chapter ahead looks like. That's really beautiful. And as we think about your journey to your current midlife chapter, what are some of the experiences and people have been most formative?
Everything is formative. Looking back, I'd say I've had a very rich set of experiences in terms of the variety of different people that I've met and known over the years, and also contrasting situations as well. So right from the beginning, I grew up in a vicarage as my dad was a vicar, and that brought me into contact with a huge range of people, a real mix of people, which the older I've got, I realize how privileged that is really to have those kind of opportunities to get to know a whole mix of different people and a mix of places as well. So when I was young, we moved from Surrey, a very leafy part of Surrey, to inner city Manchester, just around the time of the Moss Side riots were coming to an end. And the house we moved into was one of the places where the police kind of took a stand to sort of prevent the riots from spreading further. So that was a real culture shock, but also those kind of contrasting experiences were certainly very enriching. Along the way, there's certainly been a lot of people, an extraordinary number of people really, that have been mentors to me and models to me along the way to learn from. So in my career, for example, when I was at GlaxoSmithKline, I had a mentor who challenged me around my self-awareness and lifted the lid on complexity really in organizations and what really drives us as human beings. So that was an area that I thought I'd understood quite well before that, and realized that I really hadn't even scratched the surface on it. My business partner, Dawn, is someone always learning from. Friends, I was thinking about my friend Stuart, who you've met, Chris, who sadly died a year or 2 ago. He just had an authenticity about him and seeing how he lived, through the years and through his illness, and then actually as he faced death as well, was extraordinary for me. I certainly miss him a lot. So Lisa, my wife, is somebody who's a real companion day to day, and she's somebody that doesn't let me off the hook. She's not slow to put the mirror up to me. So her and the kids as well, actually, who aren't really kids anymore, but I certainly have found that they take you to places that you would never have imagined that you would have gone yourself. But I certainly learn a huge amount from them, both in parenting, but also just from them as individuals as well.
I find the kids keep us very, very humble, reminding us that we know nothing.
Exactly. And they look at you as if to say, you know nothing as well.
You know nothing. I know. Get back in your box. And as you look through maybe your working life, can you see a thread of purpose that has run through those things that's brought life and joy for you?
An important thread which is about growing and how those different relationships and experience shape us, certainly in the good times and also maybe even more so in the hard times. I was listening to a piece about the wilderness and wildernesses in our lives the other day. And wilderness is in terms of times and places where we simply don't have the resources to hand or within ourselves to kind of cope with the situations that we're in. And those wildernesses being times that cause us to, or have certainly caused me to ask myself new questions, to reach out beyond myself, which I wouldn't say that comes naturally to me. I like to try and do everything in my own strength. And those wildernesses also contain kind of springs of life in terms of new insight and deepening faith and relationships that go further and deeper, as well as you trust people. An important thread when I think about life through to midlife is about what is formative and how those different experiences are growing me and shaping.
Excellent. Nothing is wasted, is it? Nothing is wasted.
No, well, that's the opportunity, isn't it? Yeah.
And I know that midlife, you touched on wilderness. Midlife itself can be a challenging time for many people. And I know you've faced your fair share as well. Are you happy just to share some of the sort of pressures and challenges that you've faced through this midlife chapter?
Yeah. I mean, there are just the kind of the pressures associated with family life and running businesses. And I think one of the things that I've sort of recognized about myself is that I find it very easy to be kind of looking ahead and being preoccupied with all the opportunities and all the threats. And the problem with that is it's so easy to miss the good things and not take them in because I'm so preoccupied with what's ahead. And midlife brings health into focus often when we, thinking about our parents as they're getting older and, friends, as I've mentioned with my friend Stuart, but also Lisa, my wife, was diagnosed with a disease about 7 years ago. And that's brought just quite a lot of treatment, a lot of time in and out of hospitals, and really quite a lot of uncertainty, some scary moments along the way. She's actually doing remarkably well, but it also brings the kind of fragility of life into sharp focus, and it rips away any kind of notion of I'm in control in those times. And for me, I would say it's confronted me with my own weakness, with my kind of lackingness, which isn't just a state of mind. It is actually the reality. And I think that's part of what midlife throws at us. There's a growing sense of our limitedness and our kind of limitations, which is counter to so many of the narratives that are around us, which are about finding your power and kind of inner strength and so on. But there are definitely times, and I think midlife brings them into focus where we're confronted with not those things, and any kind of ideas that they were there in the first place melt away. So I think one of the questions that midlife asks us is, how do we respond to this kind of growing awareness of weakness and limitation that comes in? Do we lean into it to see actually what treasure it holds for us and what breakthroughs it brings for us that enrich us, or do we kind of distract ourselves from it and try and ignore it, or and pretend that it's not really a thing? I think that's one of the big questions that's come through for me.
I've been very privileged to have many walks with you in beautiful countryside and pub lunches where we've chewed on life and reflected. Yeah, I can think back 18 months ago or so, that was a particularly thin time for you when you were running on vapors and life was sort of coming in from every angle. Are you happy just to share how that was for you and what you discovered in the midst of that wilderness time?
Yeah. I mean, certainly important relationships like ours, where there's trust and openness, where you can be honest, where the other person, that they've got your best interests at heart, where you can't get away with just a sort of surface level explanation of what's going on. I think, those relationships and having those are gold dust, really, because they take time to build up those relationships, but it's in those times that the value of them is really clear, especially if you're somebody like me who tends to go into most things thinking, well, what difference am I going to make to other people in this, as opposed to, well, what difference, what am I going to need to sort of hand over in this sort of situation. So I think in those friendships, important relationships, and then for me as well, it's been a time of making sense of things from a sort of personal, psychological point of view, and exploring some of those kind of thinking patterns for me, and also believing in a God that I can trust, even when things don't make sense, and having a kind of a worldview that looks beyond this life, which brings a kind of purpose and a meaning to those experiences and gives them perspective. You can look ahead and trust and keep going with the support of friends, I think.
Jonathan, thank you for your candor. I mean, it is something where, as you say, there are lessons in the wilderness and there's learnings for us in there. As you reflect on those lessons that you've learned, are there any that stand out that would be helpful for other people to hear?
I mean, certainly how we think, where we choose to direct our thoughts. I heard a good little phrase the other day, which is attention is the ignition key for the mind. And I thought that really got to the nub of being intentional about our thinking, being aware of our thinking and making the most of our thinking. I think especially in uncertainty and times of change, developing thinking practices that help us make sense of midlife, that help us to adapt and solve problems and find new ways of thinking about things and new ways of doing things. I think how we think is critical as a kind of takeout from what to work on.
Just tell me a bit more about that attention then. How does attention ignite our mind?
Well, I mean, our minds are so busy, aren't they? There are so many things going on. And so where we choose to put our attention, and I think very often we're not really, our attention is being grabbed by everybody else and everything else. It's very easy to be overwhelmed in our thinking as we try and juggle loads of different things. And I don't think it's about trying to do less necessarily, but it is about having agency really about our own thinking, taking our own thinking captive in a kind of way, and being able to choose, well, where do I want to put my thoughts? Because everything else will flow from that. So it is something that we have choices around, but it's very easy for the agenda for our thinking to be driven by all sorts of other agendas, which may be good or they may not be great.
That's great. And thinking is something that you've become a bit of a professional and an expert on, right? Tell me your journey with thinking and where you've come, what you've done with it from a work and a practice perspective.
Yeah, thinking is interesting because we're always being told what to think. Everybody tells us what to think, but we're not taught how to think. Not really. When you think about all the things that we're taught to do, what are the processes of how we think. How is our mind built to think? And over the last 2 or 3 decades, there's been massive progress really made in terms of our understanding, in terms of the science of how we think. And there's a huge amount there that we can draw from, but it's often quite inaccessible. I run a research business called 100% Cotton, and we weave different data sources, different insights together for our clients. And it's really about understanding different needs and different perspectives in order to help organizations make breakthroughs in terms of future development of their organizations and their brands and so on. And we did a project, an internal project, which was to say, let's understand more about how we think. And how people think in general. And that was partly to inform our own analysis methodologies, so that we could make more of our thinking in that process, because really that's a large part of what we're paid for. But also, I think I was increasingly aware that that was only half the job. The other half of the job was what happened in our clients' minds in a boardroom as we're sharing those findings. How are they thinking with what we're giving them? And that was often a bit of a mystery, because there were sometimes you could share the evidence and it'd be very well supported and so on, and it land brilliantly. And other times you'd think, well, that just didn't land, and I don't know why. As you're walking to the lift out of the boardroom, you're thinking, what happened there? And, was there anything different about what we did, and so on? And so recognizing that actually, how people were thinking with the insights that we were bringing to them was a very, very important part of our responsibility, really, in terms of being able to inform that and understand where they're coming from and being able to talk into that. So to be as helpful as possible. So from that internal project, we developed a new framework that recognized 4 different thinking strategies, which I'll have a chat through. And those thinking strategies are about how we use our minds for sense-making, problem-solving, creativity, all of those kind of critical human capabilities. And it was something we were playing around with internally. We had a relationship with Bath University, and it had been included in a module, a Bath Uni MBA module around the psychology of decision making as a kind of reference point. But also we started working with some organizations, helping them. So, for example, we worked with the Prince's Trust as an early project, with now the King's Trust, of course, where their challenge was that they found that they were going through the same strategy process every year and not really coming up with anything different. And it was sort of, how do we rethink things? How do we think differently was kind of at the heart of their challenge. So we worked with them, not to tell them what their strategy should be, but to equip them with different ways to think about their strategy. And they came up with a number of significant breakthroughs as a result of that, and it freeing them up to think in different ways.
What's this taught you about how thinking changes as we age, and particularly thinking of this midlife phase in the ones that precede and the ones that follow?
I think a really important thing that happens, slightly worryingly, from our 30s onwards is that the versatility of our thinking narrows. And so if I just explain the 4 thinking strategies very quickly, what's happening is that we become increasingly dependent on one of those thinking strategies in particular, which is expert thinking. So expert thinking is the mind's ability to unconsciously recognize patterns through experience. So it's why sometimes, somebody can ask a question of you, particularly if you're in a leadership position, and you can give a pretty rapid answer back as to what you think is going on, or what you think they should do. That's invaluable, because if we had to start from scratch every time, and that's kind of why we've done our 10,000 hours, isn't it? To build that experience, to build that expertise. And it's why people often come to us in leadership positions to say, what do you think? What do you think's going on here? What do you think I should do? But there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy here that happens, or a self-fulfilling kind of pattern that happens, which is, as we get in, that's what has got us into those positions of leadership often, is that kind of experience and that expertise. And so we rely increasingly on our own expertise and judgment, and other people look to us to use our own expertise and judgment more and more. And I think the extreme of this, working with different teams around the world, for us was in Japan, sitting in Tokyo with a leadership team there, where, literally the most important person in the room had the mic. If that person left, then the next most important person had the mic. And everybody looked to the leader, whoever it was at the time, to make decisions, to have the answers and so on. And actually the leader kind of broke rank with his team in some ways and said, look, this is just putting me under a huge amount of pressure. I'm just not able to have all the answers. The reason we're a team is so that we can make the most of all of our experiences and all of our different perspectives. So working with them to use other thinking strategies and not just rely on that expert thinking was a big part of what we were doing there with that team. And if we think about expert thinking a bit like a riverbed, it's our neural pathways. Once we follow a line of thought or a pattern of thinking, the more we use that, what fires together, wires together in our brain, the more we use that, the deeper that channel becomes. And actually, the more instinctive and automatic that thinking pattern is. And so, when we see something going on, our mind defaults very quickly to what we think we're seeing. The big problem with it is that when the past doesn't predict the future. And so, if you've got a blueprint that's worked for you many times over and you keep applying the blueprint, but actually you don't notice that the context has changed, maybe subtly, maybe more significantly, then actually, what's going on requires you to think in different ways. Suddenly your expertise and your experience can be as much of a liability as an asset. And, that's a challenge for us as we're in midlife, because, we value our experience enormously. Yeah. And there's that question when somebody says to you, well, what do you think the answer is, Chris? And you say, well, I think it's this. And then the follow-up is, well, I just want to sense check this. How confident are you? All the research shows that confidence is not a very helpful read on how successful the outcome's going to be, because that confidence doesn't relate to how relevant the experience is to the problem that's being faced. And so actually the most helpful question to ask isn't how confident are you, but to really explore how relevant is your experience to this situation, and to look at that in the kind of cold light of day. So that kind of narrowing in around that particular thinking strategy, expert thinking, is a big pattern that we see. But the great thing is that we are able to use these 4 different thinking strategies. Actually, we've all got the capability to use these 4 different thinking strategies. So the first one is expert thinking.
What else can we draw upon, Jonathan, to make a good decision?
And I think, that is about being aware of really having our antennae out for what's changed. And recognizing that in some cases it's not in our interest to spot those things because it disrupts us as much as the organization we're leading. But the other 3 thinking strategies, so there's expert thinking, as we talked about, there's link thinking, which is the brain's ability to make new connections between things that were previously unrelated. So within each of our minds, each of our brains, we have the capacity to make more connections than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So our potential for making new connections, as opposed to just sticking with the same riverbed, is almost infinite. In practice, it kind of is infinite. And so putting ourselves in situations which aren't hugely familiar and being open to ideas and inspiration and noticing things going on around us and expecting to make new connections rather than just looking out for the familiar is an incredibly important thing to do. It can also be quite an uncomfortable thing to do. One of the things that we've noticed working with organizations is, and we found this sort of qualitatively and quantitatively, the larger organizations, people working in larger organizations do this much less because, they are in a bubble, which is the organization. And so their reference points, I mean, you see it when you walk into the kind of foyer seating area on the way in. Nearly always the reading material is just stuff from your own industry. And so the reference points are insular and narrow. I'm not totally criticizing that. I understand why that is, but it does reflect a kind of reality, which is you can become very insular. And what we notice as well is link thinking is not hierarchical at all. The person that is best able to make links across things is nothing to do with their experience. It's just whether or not they are practiced at making connections between things. So, for example, the roll-on deodorant was invented by somebody who was trying to face the problem, how do I get this kind of messy stuff to have a kind of secure, even distribution in your armpit? And their reference point was the ballpoint pen. That's where it had been solved before. And so, very often the problems that we're facing have been solved somewhere else. The question is, are our minds open to spotting those different things? Very often in nature, actually, there's a whole area of science called biomimicry, which is, recognizing, taking great things that work in the natural world and applying them in through innovation and so on. And a lot of it is about cultural permission. So that's link thinking. And then there's depth thinking, which is the really familiar stuff. It's what we're taught to do at school. Sit down, study, analyze, logical, linear process. It's brilliant because it provides you with evidence. All of these thinking strategies have tremendous brilliance, and all of them have significant biases or drawbacks as well. So the big drawback, of course, of depth thinking is it can just take a very long time, and we don't have time to do all of that. We've got to make a decision now. So that's depth thinking, very familiar. And the fourth one is click thinking, which is we notice this when an idea pops into our head and it's a kind of aha moment. And it could be something that we've been mulling over for a long time, and it finally just falls into place like that in that click moment. Or it might just sort of come, that kind of light bulb idea of, it's a kind of flash out of the blue. The brilliance of that is it can just leap you forwards. Some of the problems around it, you can't kind of force it to happen. You can't kind of make it happen, but you can definitely put yourself in situations where you can pretty much ensure that it doesn't happen if you don't leave any space for your mind to wander. And then even then, when we fall asleep, that might be a time. So the question there is, are we noticing those things that are coming through? And very often we're not, because we're so task orientated.
So that's really interesting, looking across those four thinking styles. What are some of the ways that you've helped organizations to think better by drawing upon that?
Yeah. So, if I give a couple of examples, so we've been working with the NHS in recovering from COVID, which is an ongoing process. As certain things just stopped or failed or just got pushed to the side, important things about how the organization was running. And then it becomes hard to get them started again. And, typically, different organizations, consultants will come in and say, oh, this is the way you should do it. Or somebody else will say, no, this is the way you should do it. And, and lo and behold, it doesn't take hold, partly because it wasn't invented here. And so you really need the people in the organization who are at the coalface, who have got the sort of tacit knowledge of how the organization works, to be insourcing the thinking for themselves instead of outsourcing it, insource it. So, but the challenge there is, how do you get that thinking out, and how do you help people across different hierarchies and different functions to come together and to sort of pool that thinking and make the most of it. And so we've been working with the NHS around that for recovery things, but also in future initiatives as well, where there's no blueprint at all, helping them to use all of their experience and the diversity of thinking and know-how that they have when they're hugely resource stretched in the first place and overwhelmed, to be able to really think well together, to think in different ways around their challenge and around the needs that they've got, and to get to a way forward for themselves, a clear way forward that actually they have created rather than somebody externally creating it. So that's an example with the NHS. And another example would be a Fortune 500 company helping them with an embedding of their organizational culture. So this was 14,000 people across Southeast Asia and Australasia, particularly, using the thinking strategies to equip all of those 14,000 people to make sense of the kind of culture keys that had been developed by the leadership team for themselves to work out, okay, so if I'm in Indonesia, I hear that's what our culture needs to be. Well, what that looks like for me in practice, in my role, is X. And so, really equipping each of those different people to understand the four thinking strategies through some online self-assessment for themselves to recognize how they're using those, a tool that we've got there, but then equipping them with a workshop that they could scale at a local level for people to work through what this culture means for them and what difference it makes. So it's really empowering. Instead of just telling them this is what it is, get on with it, it's really empowering them to say, okay, I'm actually responsible for working this out in my place with my part of the business.
That must be fascinating to look across 14,000 people across all those geographies and cultures. Were there any things that surprised you or them about the way people think, specifically regard to this cultural change?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously some cultural differences by country. So the click thinking, for example, which, where there is more of a tradition of meditation and that sort of reflection, then you could see a number of those Southeast Asian countries that felt much more natural there than in European countries, for example, or even in Australia and New Zealand and so on. But I think the thing that we were surprised by was how universal the four thinking strategies are. So there are differences at an individual level and so on, but overall, there's a pretty consistent pattern around the use of those four thinking strategies. And so it really gave us a quite a strong sense of, this is a universal framework for people to use.
So that insight is really fascinating around the four thinking styles being kind of universally consistent across the organization and across the world. For many of us, AI is being encouraged to do more and more thinking at a quicker, cheaper, faster rate. How can we think better in a world of AI?
I think quite often the AI is pitted as a kind of an alternative to human thinking in certain situations, and the concerns around AI replacing people and jobs and those things. I'm sure certain tasks and so on will be. I don't have any great predictions as to what's going to happen there, but I think what it does that's very helpful is, there's language around AI in terms of thinking about networks and so on, which are all built on an understanding of the human brain. All the reference points there are how we are built to think as human beings and made to think, and in trying to replicate some of that to a certain extent. I think what it does is it really increases the need for us to make the most of the extraordinary brilliance and to be much more aware of the bias that is in human thinking. So I think in some ways it's a kind of rallying cry for humanness, for being a person, not a machine, And so I think it will mean that we do need to be more aware of how we're thinking. If we're going to think with machines more, we need to be aware of, where is the interaction? Where are we playing and what are we asking the machines to do? But I think it also drives towards more uniquely human capabilities in terms of that sense making, in terms of creativity, in terms of, where there isn't any past data or information to plug into. How do we imagine the new? How do we dream up the future, make connections that have never been made before and create new patterns? So I think there's that, but also I think there's a huge amount around human connection as well in terms of relationships, how we use our minds really well there and use our full thinking capability in terms of really developing deep connections with people and meaningful connection with people. I think the AI will play an important soothing role in relationships, but that's not the same, the joy and the meaning that comes from really connecting with another person, on knowing that you've been heard, on knowing that you've been understood is really profound. And equally, the joy and the sense of meaning and accomplishment that comes in creativity, in opening up a new pathway, in putting two things together that have never been connected before to create a new way forward where it didn't look like there was one before. These are, I think, people at their most human, really at our best. And so I think how we think and an understanding of that is incredibly important, and celebrating and drawing out the brilliance of human thinking, as well as recognizing the biases and the drawbacks of human thinking in order to counter those.
And do you see AI predominantly playing the role of that expert and deep thinking in a balanced thinking approach, and leaving the link thinking and the click thinking as the more exclusive preserve of the human mind? Or do you have a more complicated view of how it works?
I mean, I think the way that we would understand, when we map it against the 4 thinking strategies, the way that we would understand it is what it's doing is really depth thinking. It's doing that kind of deep analysis, but just at an extraordinary speed. So it seems like expert thinking. At a human level, it's like you can't answer that quickly through depth thinking, and yet, and so it looks to us like expert thinking, but it's actually, it's depth thinking. It's looking for patterns. It's looking for the established connections that are there, and then pulling those together and saying, what about this? So, I think it's going to be incredibly important for us, and hopefully it'll free us up to be using our creativity and using ingenuity, actually, as human beings, and in really using our energy to, work on those relationships and deepen those connections. So I think hopefully it will enable us to play to our strengths as human beings, as opposed to just the heavy lifting.
Thinking about myself as an individual and maybe myself as a leader in my organization, how can I and we start to think better? Have you got any kind of practical tips, hints, guidelines, frameworks that we can start to adopt and apply straight away?
Yeah. If the tendency is for our thinking to become more rigid, but recognizing that we're equally capable of becoming more adaptable and diverse in our thinking, then having an awareness of how we think in the first place. As I said earlier on, we're not taught how to think. We don't necessarily have a language for how we think. In some ways, that's been sort of led by the AI world for a number of us. But so just thinking about 2 roles, really. First of all, thinking about in kind of leadership and with teams, and then thinking about how we can think fully for our own personal growth. So for leaders and teams, I think developing an awareness of how we think, not just what to think, really equipping our teams to be able to think well, to think fully for themselves, to use different ways of thinking, to unlock that brilliance and counter the bias. And so even just, we often in organizations now have, and teams have a language around different personality types and so on, but we don't have a shared language around how we think. And the problem with that is that so much of our thinking is implicit, and for teams to work well, our thinking needs to be made more explicit. And so having a language for how we think and being able to think in different ways is incredibly important. And I think where it really comes into focus is when there isn't a blueprint, when the past doesn't predict the future. When you're in a point of change and uncertainty, just turning the handle and doing the same thing again probably isn't going to work. And so having an understanding of how we think and being able to make that part of the conversation and freeing people up to think in different ways. I think very often there's a culture that rewards and implies that certain ways of thinking are more valuable than others, as opposed to making the most of the diversity of the thinking in the team. So that sort of top line level, that's the organizational leadership challenge, I think. For our own personal growth, this is something that we've been working on. We were kind of spurred into it really from COVID. And in some ways, it's a kind of midlife murmuring of its own. So developing thinking practices that help us see the patterns in our thinking that are shaping our relationships, our decision making, and our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. So it's really fascinating to explore the networks of our own thinking. And it's hugely powerful to be able to create new patterns of thinking that can open up new spaces and kind of create some order where things might have been a bit noisy or chaotic before. So we've developed some specific thinking practices for people to use. And I can share those. And we've also developed a little beta app, which helps us to see the patterns in our thinking. And we're kind of calling it Jot to Spot, which is Jot is just one thing, to spot, which is to see patterns over time in our thinking. So, for example, one of the thinking practices is gratitudes, which definitely isn't a new idea. But on the whole, a kind of gratitudes practice is about recognizing, what you're grateful for that day and so on, and then you move on. Well, actually, you're missing a whole load of value in that, because if you just jotted just one thing a day of something that you're grateful for, and then pause to look back, and the app helps you to move those different pieces around on the canvas and to make connections between them, then you can start to spot, actually, what are the patterns in what I'm grateful for? What does that reveal about what I value? What does that reveal about what makes a difference to me on a day-to-day basis? How does that help me to spot, well, where should I be putting myself more often to be able to benefit from those things? And are there any surprises about what's not there, as well? So that kind of seeing patterns over time thing is incredibly important. There's a thinking practice as well around problem solving, which recognizes that our brain is best at problem solving when we prime our brain with the problem. So we think about it quite hard. We can use expert thinking to recognize our assumptions and our initial thoughts on it, our kind of gut feel on it. We can use link thinking to blow our thinking out and to start to recognize maybe analogies or connections where we've maybe seen this before. We can use depth thinking to do some of the heavy lifting and to do some of the hard work there in terms of, seeing where the patterns are and seeing where the connections are. But then crucially, and this is what we don't do very well in organizations, is then you need to switch off. You need to let your brain do some of that work, because it's in click thinking that the connections between our neurons can loosen slightly. And actually, that's why you can wake up in the morning, for example, and say, okay, I can see this much more clearly now. It's because some of that filtering has gone on. And so, that thinking practice, that problem solving thinking practice just walks you through the problem that you want to solve over whatever time period that you need, and helps you just to unlock it for yourself, which is hugely rewarding. And actually, generally speaking, yes, we can get input from other people, which can make a huge difference. But generally speaking, we kind of know when we've got to an answer or when we haven't. And then just as an example, we've got, I think, 6 different thinking practices. The third one, we call it contemplate. And I find it incredibly helpful from an attention point of view. And so you might take, I don't know, an idea or a verse or a line from poetry or a quote from somebody. I will often take a Bible verse, and before I go to bed, I just put it into my mind. I try and memorize it. And then it's a 24-hour period of contemplation where you just take moments during the day, literally moments during the day, just to bring it back to your mind and say, okay, well, what have I heard here? What have I learned here? And it's a kind of an unfurling and an unpeeling of, something that your initial thoughts about it. It's surprising how much you can go deeper on that and really sort of get the value out of something. And it's a brilliant thing for attention, because it is thinking about something which is generally helpful. It increases your own capability in that way, but it also gets you to new insights and real sort of gems from that you can sort of mine really and make the most of. And it builds us up as human beings.
There's a phrase that I have heard recently from a poet called Joshua Luke Smith, where he says, the door is in the floor. And what he means is the door to the life we want is right under our feet now. And I have ruminated, chewed, thought, reflected about how do I live a more present life, which recognizes that this is it. This is it. Yeah. And this is what matters, is being in this moment and being fully present here. And yeah, I can see how that contemplation practice is really, really powerful in just helping you to chew and to extract all the goodness out of that topic that you're contemplating on. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
I think especially if you're somebody like me, where you're always thinking, away from the moment. Actually,
Yeah.
it does ground you and center you in where you are. Yeah.
I can think back to another time where I was working 3 days a week for many years as a young dad. Some of my best thoughts came when I was digging the garden on Friday, or walking down the beach or something else, just getting away from it all and suddenly just giving it the space for those things to settle, the insight that would come. And then I'd go back, not only physically refreshed, but ready to roll on the Monday morning, going, right, now I know what we've got to do. And it would be really, really powerful. Listen, I know you've done a huge amount of work on Thinkfully. I know there's a lot of research gone into it and a lot of practicing and testing. Looking forward, though, do you have an ambition for Thinkfully and its work and its insights?
Yes. So I think it's in the name, really. The ambition is for people to be able to think more fully. When I look at what's going wrong in organizations, in our own lives, in the world, somewhere in the mix there is narrow and limited thinking. When I think about my kids, for example, or the boys that I'm coaching rugby, so that whole kind of next generation thing, and I look at the world as it seems to be moving, what to think will be out of date before they've thought it. So what becomes incredibly important is how to think, how to discern, how to create new possibilities, how to unlock, sense where it just seems like noise and chaos, and how to make sense of stuff, how to problem solve and so on. So, and how to think together as well. Because I think that's, if we can build that kind of self-awareness, understanding of the world and creativity, then I think that's a good contribution.
Yeah. And do you think that you will be able to do that just as Thinkfully, the organization you have now, or is it something you're looking to share that journey with others in terms of helping it find its full potential?
One of the things that I've learned over the last however many years is to not always try and do things in my own strength. So I love chatting to people about it, and I love working with people around this, and seeing what they do with it, really. So I'd love to find people to work with on it for us as an organization, to build it into organizations in terms of it being part of a mentoring, that kind of practice within organizations, for it to be something, talking to a school at the moment about whether it's something that could get built into that sort of development and that kind of educational piece for them, so that they leave school with those reference points and that understanding and those tools. So really, across the board, and if anybody's listening to this that's got good ideas, I'd love to chat.
Perfect. And look, finally, Jonathan, if you could whisper one truth to Jonathan Salisbury of 10 years ago that would help you navigate this chapter of life, what would it be?
I think to make the most of it all, to take it in, enjoy the good things, not always be dashing forward. I think one of the things I'm really appreciating at the moment is, when our kids are all together, just sitting back and watching the laughter and the chat and the Mickey taking and all that stuff. So I think that, learning to do that better is certainly something that I would want to go back and mention to me, and also just not to try and do everything in my own strength. To trust God, to trust others along the way, and to reach out more. So I appreciate your encouragement with that, Chris, over the years.
Yeah. It's just been fantastic, hasn't it, really? There's a phrase about friend sharpening friend. Yeah. And I know that on our conversations, our walks, our sort of telephone calls, you have sharpened my thinking. I know you think in a different way to me, and I think in a different way to you. And by bringing those together, it really does reflect this midlife commemoration, of us coming together and sharing wisdom and stories and experiences and truth. Jonathan, thank you so much. If anyone's sitting there listening going, I'd love to learn more about these thinking styles, or I'd like to talk to you some more about an idea I've got for them, how can they find out more about how to think well, and also how to get in touch with you?
Yes. So our website is thinkfully.co, and you'll find all sorts of resources. We've got a digital journal on there and so on. We've got a self-assessment as well, which just a 5-10 minute piece that then give you some feedback on how you're using the thinking strategies and specific opportunities to develop one or two of those. So certainly reach out. I would love to be able to have a chat. And if you'd like to use the thinking practices, and if you'd like to try out our beta app, then again, delighted if people want to have a go with those as well. Or if you've got ideas about how to take this forward as well, then that would be really good to hear.
Great. And I know you can find Jonathan as well in our Midlife Murmurings LinkedIn group as well. So if you haven't joined that yet, please do join it and join the conversation, and we'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts. So thank you, Jonathan. All the best, my friend.
Thank you. Cheers, Chris. Thanks. Take care.